Welcome to the final class. Well, not exactly the final class, but I'm welcoming you to the last class of this phase where we are studying about the overview of the Bible. Now, in the past couple of classes, we've been looking at how the Bible is broken down into the foundationals and how it's broken down into the historical and the instructional. And we dealt with that in the Old Testament, and we started dealing with that in the New Testament. And we dealt with the foundationals in the New Testament, and we said those are the Gospels. We dealt with the historical in our previous class. We said there's only one historical book, interestingly, in the New Testament, which is the book of Acts. And we looked through the book of Acts about how the people were trying to live out the revelation of Jesus that they saw in the foundational. And we said three things characterize that lifestyle that they live, which was the gospel being preached, the gospel being received, or the gospel being rejected. But we ended that class when I mentioned that three things, as people live through all of that history where the gospel is being preached and is being received or rejected, three things came out of it. Number one, individuals were being saved, they were being transformed, they were being changed by the new light of Jesus Christ that they saw, both Jews and Gentiles. These individuals that were being saved became a collective, so a collective of individuals that are saved, and they formed what you call the church. Okay, so as missionaries were moving around and bringing that light into every cities, people were being transformed, coming together as collective and becoming a church. So the number two thing we saw as a product of that is the church. The number three things we saw was that with the church growing and with most of the missionary going around and preaching this gospel, not exactly staying in those locations, but continuing to move around, especially people like Paul, there is now a need for people to be able to manage this coming together of people. And that's where the leaders came into the picture, which the words likely used were elders. So three set of people, or three institutions, so to speak, came out of this historical period: the individuals, the church, and the leaders. Now, as these people live, through this history, instructions were coming to them, and these instructions were coming to them for different reasons: for teaching, for encouragement, and all of that. And we will see that in a bit. But here is the way I want us to kind of look at this so that we kind of tie everything together from this point. Now, this look like a house. Okay, so the instructions, or which are contained in the epistle, in my view, and I believe this is the easiest way, that I can explain it. Think of it like a house. All right. If you think of a house, there is usually the foundation. Okay, and in our case, the foundation is the foundation are the foundational things. So foundational things. So on top of that was layer the historical, event. Through the history, there were a bit of learning here and there. Which is always, as you embark on your adventure of Bible study, the general principle is that things that happen in the book of Acts cannot be used as basis for doctrinal conversation. Because the whole idea is that in the book of Acts, through that history, the church, as a new phenomenon was just being born. And there were a lot of things that the people don't have figured out. So it was a period of learning. So mistakes here and there. So it is as you come into the epistle that the people could look back, they could then develop letters, documents that are devoted to training people, to educating people, to encouraging people, to helping people see things in different perspectives. But the way I want us to look at these letters is to think about it as in three dimensions. Again, don't forget, I did mention that there were three people that came out of the whole scene, the whole historical period: the individual, the church, and the leaders. And when you look at the letters, they are broken down into addressing all of those institutions. Some letters were addressing the church, and some letters were addressing the leaders in the churches. But there were some letters that were basically addressing individuals, or that were addressing people, the saint, on an individual basis. They were not focused or directed at the church. So you can call those ones the general letter. So if you look on the, again, I can't tell if it's right or left to you now, but you see that one side there is letter to the churches, letter to the churches. There is actually 10 of them. Okay, those letters to the churches. And there is the general letters, which again, I said are letters to individuals. Okay. And then at the top of it, again, when you think about the structure of the house, the top, okay, the leaders are at the top. So at the top, you have the pastoral epistle, or what I call letter to the leaders. So let's take this one after the other. All right. So if you look at the letter to the churches, you see there Romans, the 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, and Revelation. Okay. Now, what do these letters have in common? Again, they are core teaching letters. The goal of these letters is to educate. Don't forget, it is as people see the light that the church is being formed. So now they need to understand the rudiment, or a lot of doctrinal things have to be taught. And the church was being taught, so salvation, what it truly means. So again, don't forget, for the first time, Jews and Gentiles who were up until this time arch enemies were being united together in this one body of Christ, which is the church. So a lot of education need to go into this. So you see people, these letters addressing critical matters like, what does it really mean to be saved? How are we saved? At what point are we saved? The coverage of our salvation. What should be our disposition to sin? How did God truly save us from sin? And of course, going on from there to other things like what should be our disposition with this understanding. But the whole idea of it is to truly help people to understand the love of God, understand how helpless they are in their sinful state, and understand what Christ really did for them in his death. Okay. It is also to teach them the core of the gospel. In other words, that the gospel is about Jesus and nothing else. Okay. It is Jesus only. It's not of works that people are saved. All right. It is by grace. Okay. And they came into this acceptance by faith. So those letters are geared at addressing that. One of the things you should also bear in mind is that, because again, it's a learning phase for the early church, a lot of people were coming also with a lot of contrary gospel. So a lot of these letters were also written to as they see those new gospel, which in one of Paul's letters, he said they are not gospel at all. As they see this gospel, they come to that point where they begin to say, I think he has a point. And Paul is saying, they don't have a point. All right. But it's also about reassuring their heart about the things that they've believed. You see clear examples of that in his letter to Galatians. When he was saying, "You foolish Galatians, what happened to you? How could you have started with Christ alone, with nothing else, and then now you are suddenly being deceived and all of that?" You see letters like Romans, which is like the epicenter of it's an embodiment of the doctrine of faith. It's like the constitution of of the gospel in all its fullness. Or letters like Ephesians that really articulate what used to be where we were before Christ found us and what we have become after Christ found us. So all of those things are the goal of the letters to the churches. Then there are the individual letters to individuals. I don't want to say letter to the individuals, but they were general letters. But these letters, they address things more on an individual basis. Okay. Now, the reason why this is important is because and again, I don't want to say unlike the letter to the churches, but again, for want of a better word, unlike the letters to the churches, these letters were more focused on growth. Okay. So while the letter to the churches is more about see who you were, see how helpless you are, and see what God has done for you. You were saved not by works. God loved you not because of what you have done. All right. The letter to individual is more of a growth. It's more of, okay, now you know what Christ has done. Now you know what God has done for you. Now you know the grace of God. Now you are a child of God, not because of anything you have done, but grow up. Okay, it's time for you to now start taking responsibility. You cannot remain a child in this house forever. In real life, a quick good way to think about it is that when you are much younger, your parents will be happy to do literally anything and everything for you. But part of the signs of maturity is that you move away from capitalizing on that, okay, and being helpless into taking responsibility and being a contributor to the building of that house. So the goal of the general letters, it's to address growth issues. So you see things like, let's move on to maturity. You see things like show your faith. So you are saved by grace through faith. But you start seeing things like in James, show this faith by action. It is not contradictory. It is a conversation of, you didn't do anything to earn this, but now you should at least start becoming responsible. So these letters address people more from the angle of growth. And then you look at the pastoral epistles, which were more of letters of encouragement for people in ministry or people in leadership, that kind of thing. The reason why all of these are important is because of the various things that each of these letters, what they address. So while one is addressing growth, the other one while one is addressing is teaching, the other one is addressing growth. While one is focused more on doctrine, the other one is focused more on what you call practicality. So you see a lot of practicalities, practical things. In the letter to the churches, you see a lot of doctrinal basis, all right, or the doctrinal basis of the things that we are then being asked to do in these other letters, that are to, um, of course, addressing things from an individual, individual level. So, with all of this, I think also the other thing to mention, is that while the letters to the churches, again, were coming at the time of the birth, or were addressing a church that was newly birthed, the the general letters, were more addressing, a growth process. Okay. While the letter to the churches, again, was, you could say, it's dealing so much with justification, as you come, and again, it doesn't mean that sanctification as a subject is not being treated in those letters, but you see more of it experientially being talked about, and by that I mean sanctification, in the general letters, again, because of the way they are structured and the goal that they are supposed to achieve. And so, as we close out on this, I think bringing all of this together, or where this apply to us today, is that as you now begin to think, or you begin to live your Christian life, or you begin to come to a position of leadership and all of that, you will have situations that you need to respond to from a scriptural point of view. You must then begin to ask yourself, so what do I need to address this at this point? For instance, if you are dealing with a group of people and you really need to, you can't tell who is who in terms of their level, and you really need to address them to be sure that everybody is aligned on the fundamentals. You know where to go. You should be looking into the letter to the churches. If you are trying to disciple people that you know they need to grow practically in their walk of faith, you know where to look at. You should be looking at the general letters. You'll find your answers there. If you are trying to address people who, they are not babes in the faith, they are grown-ups, maybe your workers, for instance, or young ministers and all of that, where should you be looking at? You should be looking at the pastoral epistles. So that's kind of an overview of how to understand all of this. But the point is that as the people continue to live through history, almost like the same way we saw in the Old Testament, these instructions were coming to them. It was coming to them as individual, it was coming to them as a church, and coming to the leaders of this group. I'm closing out with these thoughts today to say, even today, these instructions are still very relevant to us, no matter where we are. As individuals, they are relevant. As a church, they are relevant. And for those of us that were occupying leadership position, these even become all the more relevant. But depending on what level you are, now you know what it is that you should be spending your time with. With that, we've come to the end of this phase. Up next, we will be going into interpretation principles. We'll be going into interpretation principles, and it's going to be an exciting time. So, with that, I look forward to seeing you in our next class.